What we're looking at here is a Sumerian tablet that actually shows the tree of life, flanked by divine beings. You can see here the Anunnaki on each side.
Researchers in a university archive in Chicago did not expect what they found when they fed a fractured clay tablet into an AI translation system in early 2025. The cuneiform wedge marks pressed into baked earth more than 4,000 years ago had resisted full interpretation for over a century. Within minutes, the system cross-referenced the fragment against thousands of similar records held in museums across London, Baghdad, and Berlin. What assembled on the screen in front of them was not a shopping list, not a royal proclamation, not a hymn to a forgotten god. It was something that made at least one researcher sit back from the desk and say nothing for a very long time. The question that emerged from that silence, and from hundreds of similar sessions conducted across research institutions throughout 2025, is the same question that has now made its way into academic journals, online forums, and late-night conversations among archaeologists who have dedicated their careers to the ancient world. What exactly did these tablets record about the origins, the categories, and the purpose of human beings? To understand why this matters so much right now, we need to step back into the deep history of Mesopotamia, the land that sat between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is today modern Iraq. This is the region where scholars believe human civilization as we recognize it first took root. Writing was invented here. Mathematics was developed here. The first cities rose from this flat, sun-baked plain. And it was here, beginning roughly 5,000 years ago, that the Sumerian people began pressing their thoughts, their laws, their mythologies, and their observations about the cosmos into wet clay using a stylus that left behind those distinctive wedge-shaped impressions we call cuneiform. Samuel Noah Kramer, the great 20th century Sumerologist at the University of Pennsylvania, spent decades deciphering these texts, and in his landmark 1956 work, From the Tablets of Sumer, described the Sumerian literary tradition as one of the oldest and richest in human history. He argued passionately that the world had vastly underestimated what these people knew and recorded. What neither he nor his generation of scholars could have anticipated was that an artificial intelligence system in the 21st century would one day read their work, and the fragmented tablets they could never fully piece together, and find patterns that human eyes had simply missed. Grok, the AI system developed by xAI, represents one of several large language models that researchers have now begun deploying as transliterative and analytical tools for ancient text corpora. It is important to understand precisely what this means, because the word translation can be misleading when applied to cuneiform. Translating cuneiform is not like running a phrase through a language app. The same symbol in Sumerian can carry entirely different meanings depending on its context, the tablet from which it comes, the dialect in use, and the century in which it was written. Entire words existed in Sumerian that have no direct equivalent in any modern language, and a significant percentage of the roughly 500,000 known cuneiform tablets remain only partially understood even by the world's most specialized scholars. The contribution that AI systems like Grok bring to this challenge is not the replacement of trained Assyriologists. It is the capacity to hold the entire known corpus of cuneiform literature in active memory simultaneously, to cross-reference a specific phrase or symbol across thousands of tablets at once, and to identify recurring linguistic patterns that no single human researcher could realistically compile across a career. When researchers at institutions, including those affiliated with the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, began feeding this broader corpus into AI analytical frameworks in 2025, what emerged was a new kind of picture, fragmented still, contested certainly, but far more complete than anything available before. Among the patterns that drew the most attention and the most controversy was the question of how the Sumerian texts described human beings themselves. for most of recorded history. Those scholars who worked with these texts treated the different terms for humans as relatively interchangeable descriptors, poetic variations on a theme, the way English writers might alternate between people, men, mortals, and souls without intending any categorical distinction. What AI-assisted cross-referencing began to challenge was precisely this assumption. Across hundreds of tablets, including material from the Great Library Archive at Nippur and texts associated with the ancient city of Eridu, believed by the Sumerians themselves to be the oldest city on Earth, certain recurring terms for human beings appeared not as interchangeable synonyms, but in systematically different contexts, associated with different activities, different social locations, different relationships to the divine hierarchy, and strikingly different descriptions of physical capacity and intellectual function. The two terms that generated the most scholarly discussion were Lulu and Sag-Giga. Lulu had long been understood as a term meaning something like primitive human, or, in some translations, mixed being. It appears in the famous Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian creation narrative that predates the Hebrew Bible's account of human origins, and which scholar W.G. Lambert and A.R. Millard meticulously translated and analyzed in their 1969 publication, Atrahasis, The Babylonian Story of the Flood. In that text, human beings are described as having been fashioned from a mixture of clay and the blood of a slain deity, created specifically to relieve the lesser gods, the Igigi, of the burden of agricultural and construction labor. Lambert and Millard's work treated this as mythological narrative, as most scholars do, but what AI analysis began to surface in 2025 was that Lulu did not appear uniformly across the tablets. In some contexts, it carried connotations of a being deliberately limited, fashioned for a narrow purpose, not expected to expand or develop independently. The phrase that scholars found most arresting, translated cautiously by researchers as something approximating those who do not increase themselves, appeared in multiple tablet fragments that had previously been catalogued separately across different museum collections. Sag-Giga, which translates most directly as black-headed people, had been understood for generations as simply one of the Sumerians' own names for themselves. The Sumerians referred to their own civilization and people using this term with apparent pride, but when AI analysis mapped every occurrence of Sag-Giga against the terms describing roles, capacities, and relationships within the divine social order, a distinction emerged that scholars had not previously catalogued with any precision. The term appeared consistently in contexts associated not with labor, but with administration, with the keeping of records, with ritual knowledge, and with the astronomical observatories that were maintained atop the great temple towers called ziggurats. This was not a population described as doing heavy work. It was a population described as knowing things. This distinction, between those created to labor and those entrusted with knowledge, sits at the heart of what researchers began calling, informally at first and then with increasing seriousness, the tiered creation hypothesis. The hypothesis draws directly from the Sumerian creation mythology, preserved most completely in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation translated definitively by E. A. Wallace Budge in the early 20th century, and revisited with greater precision by scholars, including Stephanie Dalley in her authoritative 1989 collection, Myths from Mesopotamia, published by Oxford University Press. In that mythological framework, the Anunnaki, the great gods of the Sumerian and Babylonian pantheon, are described as designing human beings to serve specific functions within a cosmic order. What the AI analysis appeared to add to this familiar framework was granularity. Different groups, associated with different terms in the tablets, seem to have been conceived for different tiers of that cosmic labor structure. Some for physical work, some for ceremonial and intellectual functions, some, according to fragments that remain deeply ambiguous, for purposes that the texts describe only obliquely before falling silent. The figure of Adapa sits at the center of this interpretive labyrinth. Adapa is one of the most fascinating characters in the entire Sumerian and Akkadian literary tradition, appearing in fragments discovered at Tel El Amarna in Egypt and in Nineveh, now housed at the British Museum. His story, which scholars including Benjamin Foster have analyzed in detail, describes a being fashioned by the god Enki, the Sumerian deity of wisdom, water, and creation, who was given extraordinary intellectual gifts, but was specifically not given immortality. Adapa is described as the most complete of humans, the one who understood language and ritual with a depth that other human beings lacked. He was summoned before Anu, the sky god, and presented with food and drink that would have granted him eternal life. But Enki, his creator, had instructed him beforehand not to accept this gift. Adapa obeyed and returned to Earth mortal, as he had always been. The story has been interpreted theologically, philosophically, and psychologically across generations of scholarship. What the AI-assisted reading of connected tablet fragments began to suggest in 2025 was something that some researchers found profoundly unsettling. That Adapa may have been described not as an exceptional individual, but as a representative figure, the prototype of a specific upgraded class of human being who possessed enhanced cognition, but was engineered to remain within defined boundaries, gifted with understanding, but structured for obedience. This is where the interpretive debate becomes genuinely heated, and it is worth being precise about the boundaries of what is established and what remains speculative. Mainstream Assyriology and Near Eastern archaeology firmly understands the Sumerian creation narratives as mythology, sophisticated, literarily rich, culturally revealing mythology, but mythology nonetheless. Samuel Noah Kramer himself, in the final decades of his career, cautioned repeatedly against reading ancient religious texts as literal historical records. The academic consensus, represented in comprehensive works like Jeremy Black and Anthony Green's Gods, Demons, and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia, published by the British Museum Press, holds that terms like Lulu, Sag-Giga, and the various other human designators in the Sumerian corpus reflect social, ritual, and narrative categories rather than biological or genetic ones. The laborers and the scribes, the warriors and the priests, were distinguished in these texts because ancient Mesopotamian society was itself stratified, as virtually all ancient societies were, and its mythology reflected that stratification. What the AI analysis introduced, and what has made researchers pause, even among those who fully accept the mainstream interpretation, is the degree of systematic consistency across tablets that were created centuries apart, stored in different cities, and discovered in different archaeological contexts. When the pattern of who is described how, and in connection with what activities and what divine relationships, hold steady not just in one text, but across dozens of independent tablet collections, the question of whether something more structured is being recorded becomes harder to dismiss entirely. Thorkild Jacobsen, the great Danish-American Sumerologist whose work, The Treasures of Darkness, remains essential reading for anyone serious about Mesopotamian religion, observed that the Sumerian understanding of humanity's relationship to the divine was fundamentally about function. Humans existed within a cosmic economy in which labor, knowledge, and worship were distributed according to design. What the AI-assisted readings of 2025 appeared to do was reveal just how precisely and consistently the ancient writers mapped out those distributions. The implications extend into the realm of what researchers were most reluctant to discuss publicly, but what spread rapidly through academic correspondence, and eventually into the broader conversation. The possibility that the Sumerian texts, read across their full surviving corpus with AI-assisted pattern recognition, describe not one origin for human beings, but several. not one kind of human being, but a hierarchy of kinds, created at different stages, for different purposes, some equipped to multiply and develop independently, and some apparently not. Whether this represents a sophisticated ancient metaphor for social class, a mythological encoding of genuine collective memory about the emergence of complex society, or something more literal and more radical is a question that the tablets themselves do not conclusively answer. The honest position, which most serious researchers have maintained, is that all three possibilities exist and that the evidence, while newly illuminated, remains ambiguous. What cannot be denied is that the arrival of Grok and comparable AI analysis tools has fundamentally changed the landscape of what researchers can ask of these ancient documents. Consider the practical reality of pre-AI cuneiform scholarship. A tablet fragment held at the British Museum might bear a phrase that, with painstaking work, a scholar could identify as closely related to a fragment held at the Oriental Institute in Chicago. Bringing those two pieces into conversation required years of correspondence, comparison of hand-drawn facsimiles, and scholarly publications that might take a decade to produce. An AI system can perform the equivalent operation across the full digitized corpus in seconds. The effect is something like suddenly being able to read a vast puzzle not one piece at a time, but all at once. And when you read a puzzle all at once, you see things that were invisible when you were holding only one fragment. The tablets also carry within them a second, layered mystery that the AI analysis brought newly into focus: the astronomical records. In the ancient cities of Nippur and later Babylon, the class of scholars known as the Amanu, the master scribes and sages, maintained extraordinarily detailed observations of celestial movements. The Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, which document the rising and setting of Venus across a 21-year period, and which are analyzed in detail by historians of ancient astronomy, including Lise Brackburnson of the University of Regensburg, demonstrate a precision of observation that scholars still find remarkable. Within this astronomical tradition, a term appears repeatedly that has been the subject of intense and sometimes acrimonious scholarly debate: Nibiru. In many tablet contexts, Nibiru refers simply to the planet Jupiter, understood as a crossing or crossing point body in the Babylonian astronomical system. In other contexts, it appears to designate the north celestial pole or a specific point of cosmic crossing more abstractly defined. In a subset of texts that fringe theorists, most famously Zecharia Sitchin in his 1976 book, The 12th Planet, have interpreted as describing a rogue planetary body with a 3,600-year orbital period. The term carries ominous associations: destruction, disruption, the darkening of light. Modern planetary science finds no evidence for such a body, but what the AI-assisted reading of the broader corpus revealed is that the ominous characterizations of Nibiru are not confined to one or two obscure tablets. They appear with statistical regularity across a wide range of texts, in contexts that suggest the ancient astronomers associated this celestial designation with moments of catastrophic transition in human history. Whether those catastrophic transitions were understood as astronomical phenomena, divine interventions, or both simultaneously is, again, a question the texts leave open. What they do not leave open is the emotional register of these records. These were not cold administrative notations. They were urgent. They were composed by people who believed that the sky carried information of vital importance to human survival, and who wrote with a seriousness about the categories of human existence. Who labored, who knew, who was permitted to see the stars. That feels, across the distance of 4,000 years, like something more than decoration. The researchers who sat with these newly assembled patterns in 2025 were not, by and large, people inclined toward dramatic conclusions. They were philologists, archaeologists, and computational linguists who had spent their careers learning to be cautious. But several have noted, in interviews and published commentaries, that the experience of seeing the full Sumerian corpus assembled and cross-referenced by AI produced something they struggled to name precisely. It was not certainty. It was not revelation. It was closer to what happens when you have been looking at a vast mosaic floor in a dark room with a single candle, moving the light from tile to tile, building up a fragmentary impression over years, and then someone turns on all the lights at once. The image that appears is not new. Every tile was always there. But the whole, seen for the first time, is different from the sum of its parts in ways that take time to absorb. What Grok and its counterpart AI systems have ultimately given researchers is not an answer to the deepest questions encoded in the Sumerian tablets. The question of who made us, whether in the biological sense established by evolutionary science or in the mythological sense preserved in the world's oldest written narratives, remains as open as it has always been. What the AI has given us is a new quality of question. The patterns it has surfaced in the ancient record are real patterns in the text, not inventions. Whether they describe the stratified social imagination of a Bronze Age civilization, a mythological encoding of something that actually happened in deep prehistory, or simply the remarkable human tendency to impose order and hierarchy on the mystery of existence, that remains for scholars and for all of us to sit with carefully, seriously, and without the false comfort of premature certainty. The clay tablets have waited 4,000 years to be read together in this way. Whatever they ultimately mean, they deserve that same patience from us, and that same willingness to keep looking, even when what we see asks more of us than we expected.